Today's session topic is harnessing interinstitutional collaborations and interdisciplinary expertise to craft winning large-scale grant proposals. This session is presented as part of our HUC Catalysis initiative in collaboration with the Strategic Interdisciplinary Research Office, more commonly known as CIRO. Please note that this session is meant to be a broad overview, whereas in the future, we plan to offer additional workshops and trainings that will focus in more depth on specific areas. So if you have any suggested topics you'd like to see, or if you think of any while listening today, please drop those into the Q&A or chat sections. For today, we encourage you to submit any questions you may have into the Q&A section as well. And in the interest of keeping things moving along to fit in our tight 1 hour time window, we'll address those at the end. And if we don't get to all of them, we'll follow up by posting a list of questions and answers on our HUC Catalysis website. So now we're going to take a moment to introduce ourselves, the presenters. I'm Brittany Grimes. I'm project manager here at HUC with HUC Strategic Initiatives. I'm going to pass it along to Camelia, and then we'll give each speaker a chance to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. I'm Camelia Cantor. I'm Associate Director at the HUC Institutes of the Life Sciences, leading strategic initiatives, under which we also have the Catalysis Initiative, and I'm also Associate Research Professor.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Martell. I am the Managing Director for HUC Institutes.
Hi, everyone. I am Diane Rudy. I am the Associate Director for the Pre-Award Research Administration team in CIRO. CIRO does have multiple teams, but I head up the Research Administration team, and I'll share more about that later.
Thank you all. Okay, to get started, here's a list of our objectives that we are seeking to accomplish today in today's session. Obviously, an overview of key components for large-scale grants. This includes securing partnerships, budget planning, broader impacts, organizational structure, assessment, and common pitfalls. We're going to talk about some strategies for leveraging interdisciplinary expertise and building strong collaborative interinstitutional teams, including with MSIs and predominantly undergraduate institutions. And then we're going to talk about some practical advice for aligning research goals with funding priorities. And then we'll briefly touch on faculty and research administrator partnerships, because after all, we are in this together.
All right, so I'll go next. As Brittany mentioned, large grant complex proposals are not something that we can cover in just 1 hour of our workshop. So we're going to follow up with a series of other workshops going more in depth in some of these areas. So today we're basically trying to cover in general terms some of the sections of these, of putting together these large grant proposals, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities and lessons learned that we can share at this point after having gone through a few of these. So one of the few things that the faculty ask when they come to my office is usually, what do you mean by large complex grant proposals? Do you consider R01 a large grant proposal? So what do you consider this? What will qualify for it? We're usually looking at it, of course, from a monetary perspective, and we usually look at it as a 1 million a year and at least 3 years or more. But the money is not the most important aspect when considering something as a large complex proposal. That's actually the easier way of looking at it. The way we look at it is actually, are these complex, meaning they're highly interdisciplinary? They involved a cross-section of schools, disciplines, institutions participating in this. Is it something that cannot be done by just one lab or 2 or 3 labs working together to accomplish? They usually involve the creation of center or institutes, consortia. And if that's not necessarily the big thing, it's usually tackling a really big question that individually cannot be answered by just a few PIs coming together. So it's normally when we look at these, the sum is supposed to be larger than its part. And this is how the funders look at it as well. Another lesson we're taking from working on these large complex proposals with the faculty is many times the PIs, the faculty, are very focused on the intellectual merit. They're looking first at the research, and that's correct. That's the way to look at it, because unless you have a very innovative, interesting research question, you're not going to be successful in tackling these large grant proposals. So it's definitely very important. You are expected to be very innovative. You are expected to think big. But at the same time, many times, what many fail to do is really be clear about what the output of that could be. What's feasible, the feasibility of their research idea. It's very problematic when trying to work across so many teams. So that's why understanding what's feasible and what's not feasible in putting together large grant proposals is something that's important for the PI and the groups and the entire team to think about. When submitting these grant proposals, there's a big emphasis on the team's ability to execute and several other aspects outside of the intellectual merit. So when you're evaluated on these large grant proposals, of course, intellectual merit tends to be maybe 1/3 of the evaluation. It depends on the different funders, but all the others count as well in the evaluation. So it's important to pay enough attention to those other sections. So for example, governance, the processes of how everything is going to be managed. And of course, to some extent, also the capability of the institution, the main institution, to support these large proposals. So as a result, if you look into the proposals for these large complex projects, they tend to have more space assigned to other sections outside of research. Our usual approach is use the Goldilocks approach, make it just right. So make sure that what you're proposing, it's sound, it's achievable, is creative, innovative, but it's easy for people to understand what you're trying to achieve, what your outputs will be, and how it can be assessed. Of course, also, these large proposals, there are not many opportunities to submit for them. So when you look in terms of funders and where you can submit for these ideas, there are many opportunities. And there's other universities who are going to submit and will try to become competitive for them. So it's important to be strategic when you put together your teams. There's politics involved in these. There's geography, where many times there's proposals that emphasize working with EPSCoR states. And of course, language plays a very important role in the final decision making. How many times have you thought, oh, this new language, this new terminology, the definition, I know we've been doing it for many years, but there's a different terminology for it. You need to be aware of the new terminology, what's fashionable, right? And utilize it to make you competitive. And lastly, on this topic, it's really important for the PIs to engage as early as possible with the program directors. While there is an evaluation team looking at these large grant proposals, when it comes to the top contenders for the award, the program director or directors have a significant say in the decision-making. So engaging with them early enough, learning from them, so many times they can't share much, but at least be on their radar and engage with them. It's extremely important, and it's becoming even more important for these large grant proposals. Brittany? Also, going back to the intellectual merit, intellectual impact, we're really fortunate to have really, really smart and creative faculty at our university, and they come with really amazing ideas. But many times, fitting those ideas to the funding mission and goals, to the funding agency's mission and goals and priorities, it's problematic. So it's very important, and we've seen cases where faculty were really, really excited about their idea, but they were trying to push their ideas to fit within some funding mechanisms where those ideas didn't necessarily fit. One example could be when faculty want to work to have international collaborators, and those are vital in their collaboration. But the funding agency does not encourage international collaborators, or maybe doesn't emphasize that, or maybe doesn't even provide funding for international collaborators. So the tendency today is to think global, but also explain how you can act local and how what you're doing can be then extrapolated, extended, made as a model for other potential institutions and places around the country and maybe the world. Highlight innovation, showcase feasibility and sustainability of your project beyond the lifetime of the award are very important things to consider. So when putting together these large proposals, we're looking at what are the steps and what to tackle first. From our perspective, it's really important to start by mapping your core team to do your organizational structure. It's very important to know who is your core team, so who are your co-PIs, what kind of expertise do they bring to the plate. And also it's important many times to have a diverse core team. I've seen very senior, very excellent faculty, but their core team, when you look at it, is all made of the same, they look very similar, just to leave it there, right? So it's very important to have diversity from disciplinary perspective, especially as many of these large proposals do expect interdisciplinarity. Diversity of gender, diversity of race, diversity of geography, all types of diversity is really appreciated because that brings diversity of thought. Also, it's really important to save spots in your core team if you have some strategic sub-awards. You're not expected to have PIs, co-PIs from all the sub-awardees, but if there's a strategic very important sub-awardee that you want to, that will play a very important role in your proposal, you want to make sure that you have them as co-PIs and you showcase how they're all well integrated into the organizational structure. Because you tend to be limited to how many co-PIs you have, for other senior personnel, many times, especially on these large proposals, and we'll talk about budget very soon, there's very little return on investment for many of the faculty who are other senior personnel. There's very little incentive for them to actually be part of these large proposals. So you have to be, as a PI in particular, to be creative about how can you still provide opportunities for leadership roles in your team outside of your core co-PI team. And the way we've been doing this is putting together organizational structures where you have positions for directors or associate directors of education and training, broader impacts leads, assessment directors, and so on. If you're working with MSIs, minority serving institutions, predominantly undergraduate institutions, it's important to engage them from the beginning because one aspect of your evaluation is going to be how well integrated all these different hubs, all those different institutions are within the project and their ability to work together and execute. So it's really important that you reach out from the beginning. You map their areas of expertise. You map your strengths and their weaknesses, and you understand what their needs are from the beginning. And that's going to strengthen your proposal if you do it that way, instead of an afterthought midway or at the end of right before your submission, which happens, unfortunately. So again, I think it's really important to understand what the team is trying, what everyone is trying to accomplish, what your team is able to accomplish, and make sure that you allocate enough resources for them to be successful post-award. Very often, PIs don't think about ability to execute post-award, but you always have to have in your minds, like, what if I get this award, which is your goal anyway? If I get this award, am I going to be able to execute? Will my team be able to execute? And you need to remember that, especially when you go back to the budget and you start cutting some of the elements in your budget, to always go back to your team and ask, if I'm cutting this, are you still going to be able to do what you're proposing to do? Lastly, on this topic, don't make final promises until the budget is finalized and the research concepts are outlined with input from everybody. It's very easy to promise first, and then when you start realizing the complexity of putting these together and actually how quickly the millions are gone, you will start realizing, oh, you have to peel back a little bit, go back a little bit, and cut some of the things. So it's important not to make major promises from the beginning, leave it open, but still have a timeline for you to clarify with everyone what's in it for them. So you've all been probably through this. When you're making your team, you have a mix of everything. People who actually do the work, people who love to be involved, but not necessarily do the work, people who look good on your proposal, but sometimes they don't do anything. So it's very important. Again, my advice here is always think, if I get this, will I be able to execute? And do I have the right team with me who's going to take on some of these things, on those tasks, and they will be able to do it? When you think about your organizational structure, this is a very important piece. And this is also something we're seeing, especially PIs who are tackling these large proposals for the first time. Very senior people who are used to being successful with single PI proposals. They are finding challenging to put together the organizational structure. So we talked about the team structure, and this is an example of a simple proposal that we had, a organizational structure that we had together, actually 3 of us on this team, presenting team. It's a simple way of showcasing how the structure will happen. But there's also, and the next slide after I go over a few things, is going to show you a more complex structure. When you put together these proposals, you have to start thinking about your decision-making process. And there's an expectation in your proposals that you're going to outline what that process is, who's going to be overseeing, have oversight of some elements of the proposal, and who's going to be accountable for those. Project management is an important component of your proposals, and we always advise to budget a full-time project manager for all of these proposals, someone whose time is going to be fully allocated for it. Also, thinking of potential risk and risk management is also part of thinking through the whole process. And of course, many times put on the side, but extremely important, and I'll cover a little bit more about this, evaluation and reporting. Making sure that in your team, internal team, you have someone who's going to be responsible for the evaluation and reporting for the entire program. In the past, we had a lot of, it's like very easy external one or a group of external evaluators who will look into your project and say, yes, it's fine, maybe give you some feedback. That is not sufficient any longer. The expectation for these large proposals is that you have one person at least assigned to your evaluation. Here is an example of a more complex organizational structure that we had for one of our centers. So as you see, it takes a lot of thinking of how all the different connections happen within the structure of what is going to be a new center in this case. So very important. Before you submit, as you see, these large proposals require almost thinking like you're putting together a business plan. So as I mentioned at the beginning, really research is extremely important. That's what is going to really make you successful, right, in a panel of experts. But for these large proposals, many times the panel is not just made of specific experts in your particular area. There might be biology experts or engineering experts, but not necessarily in a specific subfield of biology. You're also going to have in those panels people who have expertise in assessment, in broader impacts, in team science, and so on. So those panels tend to be, at least in the initial pre-selection, they tend to be very, very spread, very different, very diverse in terms of expertise. So that means that research, especially STEM research, is not going to be enough. You have to think of how do you tackle and are creative about the other sections of your proposal. Education and training. There's more and more emphasis on training students for careers that do not yet exist. How can we do that? The broader impacts and the broadening participation, the team science, open science, SciArt. How can we leverage some of the programs that we have at the university or maybe at your partners that you bring in that could strengthen those sections of your proposals? Think very broadly. It could be from humanities, it could be from business, from law, depending on who your stakeholders are. User-inspired translational research is also something that's becoming sort of the hot thing to have on your proposals. Enhancing diverse perspectives and public engagement. So these are things that you have to be creative about, because when you look into these proposals, almost everybody tends to talk about some level of education and training. What is going to differentiate your proposal from the others? Almost everybody is going to need to have some type of broader impacts or broader participation, right? What's going to make you different from the others so you can stand out with your proposal? Talking about broader societal contributions and impact, many times people think, okay, broader impact should be education and training. And that's okay. A lot of these sections actually have education and training, even though some of the sections have a separate requirement to cover education and training separate from the broader impacts. But you have to think about broader impacts from a much more extensive perspective. It involves inclusion. It involves public engagement. And again, it depends on who your main stakeholders would be. Then you have to be creative about how can you showcase that you're going to engage them, proactively engage them to understand and benefit from your research. Societal well-being. Who's going to be impacted in the society by these? The development of the future STEM workforce. That could be from your students, or it could be outside from industry partners that you may bring into your proposal. What kind of partnerships are you going to see? Strengthening partnership between academia, industry, government could also be part of the broader impacts. Contributing to the improvement of national security is usually not really thought about among the PIs as being a broader impact approach, but it's part of the broader impacts. Enhancing the US economic competitiveness and building infrastructure for research and education. All of these, and maybe others that we didn't think of, this is an example that NSF has, are really, really options that you can consider for your broader impact. What we're suggesting here is that, first of all, instead of trying to build something new, you need to map the available broader impact opportunities within your institution or within the institutions you're partnering with on these proposals, and leverage everything possible, because there's a section of usually of institutional commitment where it's good to have to showcase your complementary resources, leverage everything possible. And that's going to help your budget as well, as long as you're able to showcase how they integrate into your project and how you can actually manage the implementation if those are not funded through the actual proposal. So one thing that we also learn as we go is that to be competitive, partnerships and good partnerships that really make sense are vital. Reason why it's really good to start planning ahead when you want to put together large grant proposals, because building feasible networks takes time. And if you start putting it together right before the proposal, it's going to show in your proposal. So building up to that is good to start collaborating, to leverage collaborations, maybe even start having tackling seed grants that will allow you to build some initial experience collaboration with those partners to showcase that you're already starting from some type of foundation. Leverage their known strengths. So for example, if we know what Penn State, we kind of know what Penn State is really good at, right? But for example, if there's areas where we're not the most well-known in Pennsylvania or across the country for, we might want to really reach out to some of those institutions that are well-known for those particular areas, more highly ranked maybe, that have higher credibility than us in some of these areas, and try to get them as partners. This is a very strategic approach that ends up making us way more competitive. I did mention before, if we're working with MSIs, PUIs, engage with them early, make sure that you listen to them, you understand what their needs are. They're not just there to train and educate their students or be your pathway or be your pipeline to graduate programs. They are very close to underserved communities. They understand them, their culture, they are trusted by them, which makes it more sense for you to work with them to achieve your objectives. And of course, many times we're seeing this, try not to overdo it. We're seeing PIs trying to pile everything just to be competitive, to put a lot of stuff in their proposals. We strongly encourage everyone to stay within the scope and the budget of your proposal, because it's quickly becoming evident, if you're trying to do too much, that your ability of executing may be really reduced. And of course, anyone who's going to give you money to do something, they want to make sure that you're able to execute. So talking about the budget, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Emily. And Emily, sorry, but this is just an example for everyone, an example of an organizational structure. We can move forward.
Okay, so once you've defined your vision, goal, and research questions, and you've got your team put together, you want to start thinking about your budget, and you want to start working on a budget draft early. Sometimes folks wait until they're at that proposal creation stage. They're working with CIRO, or they're working with their research office. But I think it's good to kind of get an Excel sheet and start working on a draft budget even before that. You want to think about who your senior personnel are going to be and assign the percentage of effort and figure out those amounts early. As Camelia mentioned earlier, we definitely encourage everyone who's proposing a really large, complicated interdisciplinary grant to have a full-time project manager budgeted into the grant. You need that person to kind of coordinate all of the post-award activities, including working with all the operations teams and the finance teams and the other post-award offices to make sure that everything is running smoothly, labor is distributed correctly, reports are going to the sponsored program agencies on time and they're correct. So it's a really important position. Also, a lot of these types of awards include some sort of event needs. So it's good to budget a % of time for an event coordinator if you have access to that. And if you need research technicians, you'll want to make sure that you're budgeting those folks. And you want to think about the postdocs and the grad students. And when you're thinking about grad students too, you want to think about if it's kind of like a 3-year or a 5-year grant, when will the grad students most likely be post-comp, or the tuition will be a lower cost, and And so you want to be kind of strategic in your in budgeting for your grad students so that you can really get the most out of your budget. Also think about how much you're going to need for subawards, work with the folks that you're subawarding, see how much they think they're going to need for their piece of the project, make sure that you're covering that cost, and make sure that you add estimates for any equipment. You want to make sure that your budget is going to cover the costs associated with accomplishing what you say you're going to do in your proposal. It's really important that you have the money to do what you need to do. And that can be really tricky because sometimes the award's just not large enough. We always suggest that you kind of create a budget just of everything you think you're going to need and throw it all in there. And then it's easier to kind of do that and then refine it. And CIRO has a phenomenal pre-award team that can help you do that in the budgeting process. We'll kind of just figure out all the things we think we're going to need. And then if we're over, we go through and we see where can we adjust, where can we reduce, and come to the number that we need to come to. But it's good to go in beforehand with a really good idea of what your needs are and how much you're going to need. Next. You also should really make sure that you understand whether or not there's going to be cost share and how it should work, and you request it very early. We don't want to wait until, a week before the proposal's due to request cost share. So there's 3 types of cost share. There's the mandatory cost sharing, which is a requirement of the award. So that's sometimes spelled out for you and a little bit easier because you know exactly what you have to do. So you can kind of budget for that. Voluntary committed cost share is cost share that you're volunteering in the proposal. So once you put that in the proposal, it's required. And that can be a little bit tricky, but a lot of times it could be additional personnel, extra equipment that's not covered in the grant proposal, or other resources that you need. And then voluntary uncommitted cost sharing is not required by the sponsor and not written into the proposal, but could be things, other institutional support that's going to happen outside of the grant, like sometimes in-kind effort from faculty members could be an example of that. Well, you want to have an idea, though, of what you're going to need for cost share if you're going to need it. And it's always a good idea to kind of create your budget based on what you're going to need, and then kind of strip the cost share out and separate it after that, rather than having 2 separate budget processes, one for the award and then one for the cost share. So CIRO, again, will help you kind of break that out and identify what's going to be cost share and what's going to be on the proposed budget. But it's just really important to be mindful of cost share and have a plan about how you're going to attack that and how you're going to make the requests. And CIRO also helps manage requesting it, which is also very nice. All set?
All right, back to assessment. As I mentioned, I would be just going a little bit over assessment, but this requires an entire separate webinar just related to assessment. As I mentioned before, it changed. Things changed significantly in terms of what the expectations for a good assessment means in a large grant proposal. And I think even in the smaller proposals right now, it's becoming different. The funders, they really need to make sure that there's a clear plan on how to assess success and what success means. If sometimes the proposal, the narrative is written too broadly, it's going to be very difficult to define from an assessor standpoint what is going to look like success, which in turn is going to look like you don't really have a good plan for assessing it. And they will have a challenge assessing it. So you have to make sure that you're doing that job for them upfront. And that's going to be also useful when they evaluate you, because they will look at that piece as well. So Again, very important to develop a well-thought, a well-integrated assessment plan. There isn't much space in your proposal many times to do that. And actually, I've been challenged myself because assessment plans tend to be very, very long and detailed. And you don't really have that space in your proposal allocated. You don't have that real estate for it. So you have to be very specific, but at the same time, detailed enough is really that Goldilocks, right? That I was mentioning at the beginning, to be able to portray, to showcase that you know what you're doing and you have the capability on your staff, on your group, on your team to assess. So what do you assess? What I learned as well, many people know how to assess student work, curriculum, things that are happening in the school, but very few know how to do programmatic assessment. And that's becoming a challenge. Finding the right people who can be your evaluators for your proposals are very difficult. It's very difficult because, again, if you bring people from education, they're highly experienced in student assessment, and they can have a very important role in the whole section, in everything in your educational section. But they may be challenged on the programmatic assessment, which needs to look at the entire organizational structure and identify which are the key performance indicators and the matrix for those. You also need to provide a clear timeline for how often those assessments will be conducted, reported, and who's going to be responsible for their execution. Looking at setting up regular check-ins and feedback loops, where then show how you will incorporate that received feedback in an agile manner is really important. Therefore, big advice is to identify, engage, and name your evaluator or evaluators before your submission. Make sure that you have them think very clearly and work with you to understand what you're trying to achieve, what your objectives are, and develop a customized evaluation plan. Because many times those are disconnected from the main objectives, or they're just thrown in there and PI say, we're going to have an evaluator hired. This is not competitive anymore. Just saying that we're going to have someone hired or someone will do this TBD is no longer sufficient and is going to cut some of the points from your evaluation. Again, we're talking about very competitive proposals, and every small thing can lower your score. So you have to think across every element and how competitive are you, and clear about all the different aspects of your proposal at every point in time, including assessment. Also, allocating enough resources for assessment is extremely important. You may have an assessor, right, an evaluator, and you assign a certain amount of money to pay them, but then you don't allocate anything for them to actually use certain platforms, to travel, to conduct surveys, interviews, or other things, right? So you have to think this through to make sure that they do have a budget to implement that assessment, right? What we've seen, for example, our most recent proposal, we were asked to allocate 10% of our entire proposal, entire budget to assessment. But normally, you can allocate 5 to 10% should start going towards assessment. And because we're in it together and we work very, very closely with Xero, I would like to pass it over to Diane from Xero.
Thanks, Camelia. So I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with Xero, so before I talk about what we do, and we're going to keep this very high level today, because as Camelia mentioned, there's going to be follow-up workshops that will get into much more detailed items, even in what Xero does. So I am here representing Xero to tell you that we have proposal development services, we have research administration services, we have graphics services, and we have project management services. So I'm the associate director for the research administration team. That is the team that looks very similar to your college research office. We will help you build the budget. We'll work on the cost share. We will actually create the application and submit the proposal. But we also have an associate director, Juliana Carson, who heads up our development team and oversees our graphics group. So the proposal development services are very robust. They include things like red team review, like I mentioned, graphics support, organization of documents. We also have our project management team, and that is led by Associate Director Crystal Hubler. And the project management services. Now, typically you think of project management, on the post-award side. However, one of the things that CIRO does on the pre-award side in regards to project management, excuse me, is that team will take a look at the solicitation, work with the PI, the research team to try to help identify project management needs. Of course, if there's a project management plan, things like that, they can also help review. But it's a unique service where the project management can take a look at the pre-award side to try to get things in line to avoid any issues on the post-award end. So again, this is just a very high level introduction of CIRO. I am just one of the associate directors. We also have Dr. Doug Wolf, who is the overall director of CIRO as well. So again, today is a high level. You can review the slide, check out our website. We just went live with a new website, I believe yesterday. So there are some more things that will be added to it. We're planning on having some more robust resource materials, things over time.
So this slide here talks about what Hub Catalysis does and how we can support you. We have outlined a brief list of how we can support you, but to highlight a few, we can do things like provide assistance with space planning for your project. We can leverage our marketing and communications team for services like website design, short videos, and logos, which are especially useful for things like reverse site visits, and we've done those before. And we can provide text from successful proposals to strengthen your proposals. We're also offering a new course buyout opportunity where we team up with the colleges to support PIs who are working on these large, complex proposals. And of course, we collaborate closely with CIRO to provide resources like technical editing, graphic design support, and budget setup advice, ensuring you have a strong foundation for proposal success.